piano played a crucial role in Robert Schumann's life and works. Initially, he intended to carve out a career for himself as a pianist. Later, his wife Clara became one of the leading pianists of the age. In addition, the piano had become an increasingly important factor in early 19th century music.
In recent musical history, piano music has become an important sector in its own right. It was here that we first witnessed the emergence of a new species of musical genius.
Schumann's development as a composer is very closely geared to the piano, the instrument for which he wrote the first 30 or so of his works. This incessant concern with piano music had a very strong impact on his output as a composer, especially in the earlier stages. In that period, you could say that he thought in terms of the piano.
In the only piano concerto he wrote, Schumann brings together his experience in writing for the piano with his symphonic ambitions. The composition of the first movement in 1841 coincided with the planning of his first major orchestral works. But Schumann only completed the piano concerto 4 years later. The first performance took place on the 4th of December 1845 at the Hotel de Saxe in Dresden. His wife, Clara, played the solo part, and the conductor was a friend of the Schumanns, Ferdinand Hiller. The review in the Neue Zeitschrift für Musik had this to say.
The concerto gave us a great deal of pleasure, notably in the last two movements. The first movement, with its frequent exchanges between solo and tutti passages, is less easy to grasp and less grateful than the other two.
This objection from a contemporary viewpoint puts its finger on one of the central features of the concerto, the even-handed treatment of soloist and orchestra. This was still an unusual factor in the music of the mid-19th century. In the previous decades, there'd been a great deal of progress in the making of pianos, and this had given the instrument a dominant status in the concert arena.
The reason for all this was the desire to make the sound of the instrument more assertive, in other words, louder. Concert halls were getting bigger, orchestras were getting bigger, and this meant that solo instruments, in this case the concert grand, had to change if they were to make themselves heard. So instrument makers had to respond to this challenge.
This gives a composer new opportunities. In defiance of the primacy of the symphony, modern pianism sets out to make its mark with resources all its own.
Schumann had little interest in the modern pianism. Instead, he looked for a way of reconciling the piano's new assertiveness with the orchestra.
I cannot write a concerto for virtuoso. I must come up with something else.
Schumann was wary of the traditional three-movement concerto form, with a quick first movement, a slow central movement and a quick last movement. Initially, he contemplated writing a one-movement concert piece, or concert fantasy. Of course, a fantasy of that kind would have given the composer the opportunity of being a great deal more imaginative, not least in handling the relationship between the solo instrument and the orchestra.
Originally, Schumann composed the first movement as a work in its own right, a fantasy for piano and orchestra. But no publisher was willing to touch it until Schumann added a second and third movement 4 years later. In 1845, Clara noted in her diary, "Robert has added a beautiful third movement to his fantasy, thus turning it into a proper concerto. I'm overjoyed, as I always wanted him to compose a full-scale bravura piece."
In a sense, then, Schumann was backtracking from the fantasy to the traditional concerto. In formal terms, he was returning to the classical mold. One reason may have been the prospects of publication. A traditional concerto was thought to be easier to sell than a one-movement fantasy.
vermarkten als diese einsätzige Klavierfantasie.
For all that, the spirit of the work is definitely new. The urge to break new ground in terms of artistic expression is unmistakable from the outset. The cascade of piano chords right at the beginning has an immediately electrifying effect on the listener.
Here we have to remember how solo concertos traditionally began. The conductor turns to the orchestra, raises his baton, and what follows is a 40, 60 or 80 bar orchestral introduction, closing with a half cadence. Then the pianist makes his appearance, either with decorative passage work or with a theme of his own. In this concerto, things are very different.
Das ist hier völlig anders.
The first theme is based on a sequence of notes standing for the name Clara. Schumann uses the Italian form Chiara, spelt with an H, and the theme begins with the notes C, B, A, A. H is German for B natural.
In accordance with the lyrical nature of the concerto, this theme is also song-like in character. It's an 8-bar theme, very vocal. You could easily imagine it being set to words. It's given over entirely to the woodwind, with harmonic support from the horns. The oboe has the melody, and the strings are silent, as is the piano.
Und die Streicher schweigen, genauso wie das Klavier.
What happens next is indicative of what Schumann was so anxious to achieve with his concerto, the close interplay between soloist and orchestra. Schumann begins immediately with a process that in a normal piano concerto would be postponed until the development section. He starts working over the thematic material that has been stated so far. This means that we have already encountered all the thematic material in this movement, although it turns up in very different guises in the later stages.
In accordance with his original intention to write a fantasy, Schumann's first movement is monothematic. He achieves his musical contrasts by constantly varying the theme in terms of rhythm, tempo, or dynamics. He'd long since been intrigued by the idea of moulding the formal layout of a 3-movement concerto into one single movement.
What I have in mind is a genre consisting of one extended movement, where the introductory section takes the place of the initial allegro, the lyrical section that of the adagio, and a brilliant closing section stands in for the final rondo.
Schumann gives the development section the character of a slow movement, thus breaking quite clearly with the traditional principles on which a movement in sonata form is usually constructed.
With Schumann and many other romantic composers, we have to think of all these classical formal concepts as if they were placed in inverted commas. Usually when we refer to a development section, what this really means is that the material set out in the exposition is modified, dissected and recombined. But there is nothing of the kind in this concerto. The theme stays more or less the same, but is given an entirely different character each time it turns up.
Bekommt aber einen völlig anderen Charakter.
Subsequently, Schumann steps up the tempo and the dynamics.
The impression we get is that he is working his way around to the end of the movement. The marking in the score is accelerando poco a poco, gradually whipping up the tempo. It is one of the few places where we have an orchestral tutti in the full sense of the word, including trumpets and drums.
Also auch Trompeten und Pauken.
But then comes a harmonic twist telling us that this is not the end after all. The piano is given a stretch of bridging figuration that takes it into the cadenza.
Schumann doesn't leave the cadenza to the whim of the soloist. Instead, he specifies exactly what he wants the soloist to play. This cadenza is divided into two sections, and in the second section he returns to the main theme of the whole movement. Once again, Schumann succeeds in giving an entirely different character to the sequence CBAA that constitutes the first part of the theme. This play with anagrams and letters referring to notes on the scale was motivated by Schumann's literary leanings. As a student in Leipzig, he would frequently repair to a fashionable tavern called Zum Arabischen Kaffeebaum and engage in lengthy discussions with other artists. Secret societies were fashionable at the time, and Schumann and his friends also established one, calling it the Davidsbund. Their pet hate was musical Philistinism, narrow-minded middle-class thinking that had no appreciation for the beauty of art. In his imagination, Schumann soon started to people his society with kindred spirits who never actually attended any of the meetings, including his friend and fellow composer Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy.
His wife Clara also belonged to the select circle of the Davidsbundler, which was the name he gave to the members of the society. All of them had pseudonyms. The choice for Clara was relatively straightforward, the Italian version of her name, Chiara.
The vehicle for the ideas of the Davidsbündler was a journal that Schumann and others had founded, the Neue Zeitschrift für Musik. It propagated the artistic ideals of the society. Its main aims were
to recall the great works of the past with all possible emphasis and to brand the exclusive predilection for external virtuosity in recent years as unartistic.
Schumann focused his attention on more inward aspects, proclaiming the advent of a new poetic age.
Schumann's concerto appeals directly to the emotions. To appreciate it, we do not necessarily require any structural awareness of the way the music is progressing. It allows the listener to focus on the individual moment without losing sight of the idea behind the work.
Verfehle deswegen die Idee des Stückes nicht.
Schumann gives the second movement not only a tempo indication, Andantino grazioso. but also a title of its own, Intermezzo. In a sense, this is like going back on the idea of a slow movement as we know it. He does not write a full-scale slow movement, he writes an intermezzo instead, thus disclaiming any idea that this is going to be a big slow movement on a par with the scale of the first movement.
The movement begins with a hesitant, dainty theme, diminutive, almost scherzo-like. In formal terms, it has the ABA form typical of a song.
While the first movement has to make do without the contrast between two different themes, here that contrast could hardly be more marked. In this middle movement, note that I say middle movement, not slow movement, one might be tempted to think that Schumann is combining the elements of a slow movement and a scherzo, the middle movements you would expect to find in a four-movement symphony.
The first scherzo-like theme is set off against a song-like middle section. Then the repeat of the first section takes a surprising turn. The first theme is not brought to a close. Instead, we hear a dreamy quotation of the first part of the theme from the first movement. Instead of bringing the movement to a close, Schumann composes a transitional passage, taking us straight into the finale.
The fact that there is a clear break between the first and second movement is entirely logical. After all, the first movement was originally a piano concerto in its own right. But by leaning straight in from the intermezzo to the finale, Schumann achieves an ideal balance between the second half of the concerto and the first. This piano concerto was, of course, written for Clara. She was the extension of Schumann's own self at the keyboard. So there was very close contact between the two of them, and we can be sure that Schumann consulted Clara on everything that he wrote. I'm not just talking about the technical side. He didn't need her to tell him what would work. He was fully able to judge that for himself. I'm referring to the stylistic side of things, the poetical side, if you like.
Robert Schumann met his wife-to-be Clara Wieck when he was a student in Leipzig. At the time, Clara was 9 years old, and her father was giving her a big build-up as a piano prodigy. Schumann was fascinated by her accomplishments. In the years to follow, they frequently exchanged ideas on musical issues. When Clara was 16, the affection between them turned into love. Robert travelled to his native town of Zwickau to hear her play, and their relationship was sealed with a kiss. But Clara's father was violently opposed to the match.
Clara's father did everything he could to foil what he considered to be a disastrous relationship, even resorting to legal proceedings. But in the end, young love prevailed. The whole dispute lasted for almost 10 years. Clara was born in 1819, and it was only when she came of age in 1840 that she could defy her father's wishes and marry Schumann.
When Robert Schumann first met Friedrich Wieck, he still had visions of embarking on a career as a virtuoso pianist. He took lessons from the much sought-after piano teacher, who, in a letter to Schumann's mother, had this to say about his new pupil.
Your son is so talented that I have no doubt that I can make him into one of the greatest of pianists within the space of 3 years.
But it was not to be. Schumann devised an over-ambitious practicing method that ruined the middle finger of his right hand and shattered his dreams of a career as a pianist. Soon he left the interpretation of his piano music to Clara.
Not only during Schumann's lifetime, but also for many years after, Clara was the leading interpreter of his piano concerto. It had a very special place in her repertory. She played it several hundred times in the course of her life, and until well into the 1880s, her performances of the work were held to be unsurpassable in their authenticity. There is a certain rhythmic similarity between the main theme of the finale and the main theme of the first movement, although they are very different in character. The dotted elements give them both a rather jagged contour, though the theme in the finale moves upwards and not downwards. And of course the character of the last movement is not lyrical but vigorous, impetuous and technically challenging.
Virtuosen Charakter zu tun.
In its basic structure and expressive scope, the last movement is certainly the most straightforward of the three. It is brilliantly written, lusty and life-affirming. All in all, it comes much nearer to what a virtuoso soloist of the time would have expected of a piano concerto. Then we have the so-called subsidiary theme, first entrusted, interestingly enough, to the orchestra. The way it's constructed doesn't seem to fit in at all with the 3/4 time the movement is cast in. You have to think across the bar lines, because it sounds as if it's in duple meter, although it's written in 3/4. The result is that, as you listen, you have no idea where the strong beat of the bar has gone. And that is precisely Schumann's intention.
The development section is indicated by a change of key and the arrival of a brief fugato section. Schumann springs a new motif on us, played by the oboe. With his piano concerto, Robert Schumann has given us music of timeless beauty, a poetic monument both to himself and to the piano.
Das Klavierkonzert ist natürlich innerhalb des
Within Schumann's entire instrumental oeuvre, the piano concerto is one of his most popular and frequently played works, and the reasons are obvious. We might in fact say that the piano concerto is the work in which Schumann, the orchestral composer, and Schumann, the pianist, come nearest to joining forces in an entirely convincing manner. His symphonies have sometimes been criticized for a lack of brilliance in their orchestration, but this is not really something we can say of the piano concerto. It is a success from beginning to end and has rightly become one of the most frequently performed piano concertos in his repertory.
How rich in invention it is, how interesting throughout, how fresh and superbly fashioned in its unity.